Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to the Language on the Move podcast, a channel on the New Books Network. My name is Bryn Quick, and I'm a PhD candidate in linguistics at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. My guest today is Gretchen McCulloch. Gretchen has written a resident linguist column at The Toast and at Wired. She's also the co-creator of Lingthusiasm, a wildly popular podcast that's enthusiastic about linguistics. Today, we're going to talk about her 2019 New York Times best-selling book, Because Internet: Understanding the New Rules of Language. Because Internet is for anyone who's ever puzzled over how to punctuate a text message or wondered where memes come from. It's the perfect book for understanding how the internet is changing the English language, why that's a good thing, and what our online interactions reveal about who we are. Gretchen, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
To start us off, can you tell us a bit about yourself and how you became a linguist, as well as what led you to wanting to understand more about the intersection between language and the internet?
I first got interested in linguistics when I was maybe 12 or 13, and I remember coming across a pop linguistics book on the shelf that was just written by someone who'd also written some other pop science books. And so I picked it up and I was like, oh, this is sort of neat. And I got about halfway through and this is just so cool. Like, I can't put this down. I can't stop thinking about this. I need to ask for all of the pop linguistics books for birthdays and Christmases and these sorts of things. And like, this is what I'm going to go to university and study. Like, there's a whole thing. You could become a whole linguist and do this sort of stuff. So in many ways, writing a pop linguistics book was a return to that experience of pop linguistics books being the thing that got me into the rest of the linguistics. I think for why internet language specifically, like many linguists, I seem to have a little language analyzing module in my brain and I can't really turn it off. You get me, down at the pub or something, and we're sitting here and we're trying to have like a nice conversation about the weather or something. I'm also secretly analyzing your vowels. That's just what my brain is doing. And so I spend a lot of time online. I wanted to know what was going on because I kept seeing people doing things that seemed like they might be part of a bigger picture or bigger pattern. People write into me or they tag me on social media and they're like, ever since I read your book, I can't stop analyzing my text messages. Like, I keep thinking about the punctuation that I'm using or like the emoji that people are picking. When does this turn off? And I'm like, I'm so sorry, you're on this side now. You're welcome to the club.
100% the type of experience that I've had as well, where your brain just starts ticking along and you're analyzing everything that everybody is saying. In Because Internet, one of the first things that you talk about is the idea of networks. And here you aren't just referring to the internet. You discuss how our networks of friends, particularly in our teenage years, have a profound effect on how we use language. Can you talk to us about what linguists have discovered about the relationship between our social networks as teenagers and the types of language that we come to use as adults?
Many of the factors that we look at as linguists with respect to language are sort of your typical demographic variables, things like age, gender, race, ethnicity, geography, where people are based. But these are sort of proxies for people who talk to each other more also tend to talk more like each other. And the easier way to study that, especially before you have the ability to say, okay, so-and-so is following so-and-so, and so they must get this amount of information from them, is to say, well, all these kids attend the same high school, or all these people live in the same town, or all these people are around the same age or the same gender and they live in the same area, and so therefore they're probably going to be hanging out with each other. But we can get more fine-grained than that. And some of the early work in this area was done at high schools. So the linguist Penny Eckert embedded in a high school in the 1980s, and she distinguishes between these two social groups called jocks and burnouts. And these two groups of kids, even though many of them were from like the same backgrounds or the same ranges of backgrounds, talked differently from each other based on the social attitudes that they were trying to embody. So in the case of the jocks and burnouts, the burnouts had a more local accent that was indexed with like like working class identity and sort of not aligning with the power structures of the school where you're like, oh, the school's going to let me become student council president. Like, that sounds great. No, it's like, I don't care about this school. I'm going to drop out as soon as I can. And I'm going to, not do this. One of the quotes from that study is whether you say a sentence that I would say, the buses with the antennas on top. And there's an example of it as the pronounced closer to how I would say the bosses with the antennas on top, as that sort of like Great Lakes northern cities pronunciation, which is a locally salient like working class identity in the area. And the burnouts were doing more of that pronunciation. This is getting at like, how do you personally identify, and you can affect your accent, even if you're not necessarily doing like, I'm going to front my A's a bit, but you're being like, I want to talk like these people because they're cool. And I also want to wear the jeans that they're wearing. And I also want to, like eat the food that they're wearing, or wear the backpack that they're wearing, or, carry my backpack only on one shoulder because that's what the cool kids are doing, or whatever the locally salient variables are. And some of those are linguistic. And there's another study by a linguist named Mary Buchholz who looked at nerd girls in California, because I had read this jocks and burnout studies and I was like, I don't really know which one of these I am. And then I read the nerd girl study and I was like, I am entirely too called out by this.
You're being subtweeted.
Yeah, I'm like, oh, okay, well, I did not grow up in California. I grew up in Canada. I still live in Canada. This sort of additional nerd group, which wasn't participating in any of these cool variables, and they were like, I'm going to pronounce things very like hyper articulately. I'm not going to drop any consonants, and I'm going to make a lot of puns. And I was like, how did you know?
Why are you in my room? How can you hear what I'm saying?
These people like wordplay. Oh, I see. So this got me interested in, like, linguists have identified that there are social groups that are relevant, before the internet day. But it was really hard to do this type of fine-grained social network analysis before the internet made us all sort of digitize a lot of our relationships and make them explicit for other people to see. So instead of being like, because if you want to do this sort of social network analysis, you can do it. What you do is you go into the high school and you ask every kid to list 5 or 10 of their friends, and maybe in order of how close they are to them or something like that. And then you cross-reference all the lists. And it sort of works in a high school, which is a relatively closed environment, where you assume that most of the kids are mostly friends with other kids in that high school. But when you get to adulthood, people stop having this sort of very consistent and predictable social trajectory. Because, like, you can say in a given area, all the 17-year-olds are going to be doing like roughly the same thing in terms of being required to go to school. Once you're, and maybe even there's an extent of like, as higher education has become more ubiquitous, like a lot of people are doing like a university stage, although not everybody, but certainly once you get to like 25, all bets are off. So, some people are like moving to a different place. Some people are taking up new hobbies. Some people are becoming parents. Some people are doing all of these sorts of things that can affect what language you use and how your language keeps shifting, but no longer in this consistent and predictable step-by-step way where you can say, okay, 13-year-olds are doing this and 17-year-olds are doing something different. But if you look at clusters of interest groups, so there's one study that I cited in Because Internet where they looked at people who had joined beer hobbyist message boards. They were talking to each other about beer tasting and all the different types of beer that they had. And there's not obviously a consistent age that everybody is. There's not a consistent other demographic factors that they are, but what they had in common was they were members of this beer group and they were learning the words to describe beer. Things like aroma or S for, I think it's scent or something like this. Depending on when they joined the beer group forum, they were using different terms, either the older term or the newer term, based on when they joined the forum. So this is sort of a time-based effect, but it's based on interest group rather than based on the sort of crude demographic factors of approximately, like, here's how all the 37-year-olds are talking. People do really different things with their lives at age 37. Like, people are in very different positions. But this is your first week on the beer forum message board versus you've been here for 2 years is like a different way of kind of slicing people according to their interests. And then there was another study that some people did about networks on Twitter where they classified people into networks based on who they were talking to. So there's sort of a book Twitter, or there's like a parenting Twitter, or there's like like sports Twitter or like tech Twitter. And these groups have skews that have some demographic factors in common. So you might get one group that's like 60-40 men to women, and you might get another group that's 60-40 in the other direction. So there's a demographic skew there, but it's certainly not an absolute. What they found was that people tended to talk like other people in their cluster more than they talked like an average member of their, I think they were using gender based on like inferred information from census information about names. But also it's saying that the way that we talk has a lot to do with our choices and our friends and who we want to associate with. And not only, okay, you're destined to talk this way because you're like 24 and female. That's a way of doing those statistics and trying to get at differences between social groups before we were able to do more fine-grained network analyses.
It's so interesting when you think, like what you were saying, I like this idea of people in their social groups, kind of, especially in those young years, try on dialects or accents or ways of speaking kind of in the same way that you do with your fashion when you're in that same age, and how all of those sort of series of tryings on affect then how you come to speak as an adult. And something else that you discuss in the book is this concept of weak ties and strong ties when it comes to language. Can you tell me, what do those terms mean? And you started to talk about gender. How can gender impact these ties?
So weak ties versus strong ties are originally from a paper by, I think, an economist named Mark Granovetter. And he talks about so strong ties are people that you know very well, you spend a lot of time with, and most crucially, they are also densely embedded into your social network. So they know a lot of the same people as you do. So if you have a group of friends who all hang out with each other, so you're friends with person A, but person B, person A and B are also friends with each other, and so on and so forth. So you have a group where everybody sort of knows each other. So you could think of something like a class of students in a school, probably all sort of know each other, or a group of people at a workplace, maybe all sort of know each other. A weak tie is someone who probably you don't spend as much time with, but more crucially, you don't have as many other connections in common. In linguistics, for example, I know a lot of linguists, but also I know a lot of people who aren't employed in linguistics, who don't have a linguistics background, because I also do media and journalism and all of this sort of stuff, pay attention to this world outside of academia. So for a lot of those non-linguists that I know, if I go to a non-linguist conference, I'm maybe the only linguist there, I'm the only linguist they know. And I'm a weak tie that to them represents this whole open community to the field of linguistics. And conversely, when I go to a linguistics conference, I'm one of the few people there, sometimes the only person there, who's not an academic, for whom my primary network is not an academic one. And so to the linguists at the linguistics conference, I am so this weak tie source of information to bridge this whole other field of people who are doing interesting things outside of academia. And what Granovetter found was that people often tend to get jobs via weak ties. For example, like you're unlikely to get a job via like your partner, because your partner and you probably know a lot of the same people because you probably socialize together. And so you'd probably know about it directly more than a person that you already know. But you might get a job via somebody that like you knew for a year or two, like 10 years ago, and you took like one class together, and for them it was like an elective, and they actually got a job in some other field, and now their field is hiring, and they know all these people who you don't know, and one of those people is hiring, and so they are sort of a bridge to a larger gateway. And it's much more common to find a job via a weak tie than it is via a strong tie, because weak ties have so many other people that they are strongly connected to, or that maybe they're weakly connected to, that can like bring in additional information. So when it comes to language change, your strong ties, people that you have a lot of friends in common with, you probably already talk a lot like they do. Like you're more likely to pick up to talk the way the people that you see all the time and that you have lots of friends in common with also talk like. But you're more likely to be exposed to linguistic innovations or to unfamiliar linguistic features, even if they've been around for a long time, but they're like new to you, via people that are weaker ties to you, precisely because they bring in this novelty to your social network, because you're not already densely connected with them. There's someone who did a statistical model of like, how do we account for linguistic innovation in terms of people talking to each other differently. And if you run a network analysis of everybody has strong ties, you don't get any linguistic innovation because everyone's all talking like each other. And if you run a social network analysis where everyone is weak ties, like no one has this dense connection to each other, I think that everybody has weak ties is sort of like being in an airport. There's just a bunch of people there and you have this sort of transitory connection with them, or being in like a tourist trap, like nobody's sort of staying there and being there the whole time, getting to know people very well. Whereas like a small town is more likely to be more dense ties because there's only so many people and so you can all kind of get to know each other. The same as a relatively closed community like a high school or an elementary school, which is, especially if it's fairly small, all the students might sort of recognize each other and have, multiple ways of getting to know each other. So if everybody's weak ties, then there's never any one thing that sort of catches on and trends, because it's just like you're not in contact with each other enough to actually influence each other. If everybody's strong ties, there's just one thing that stays popular the whole time. But if you have this mix of strong and weak ties, so let's say I hear a new form from someone who I know is a weak tie, and then maybe I hear the same new form from someone else that I know is a weak tie, and I say, oh yeah, maybe I'm going to start using this, and then it can spread to my strong ties relatively easily, but I got it from my weaker ties. Or conversely, maybe I get something from one of my strong ties, but they got it from a weak tie. So you have this sort of additional source of chaos. A stranger comes to town, brings in the exciting words from, the next village over kind of thing.
What does gender have to do with that? Like, what do we know, especially about younger girls and language development?
So the traditional finding in sociolinguistics is that young women are on the vanguard of linguistic change, and that, this has been found over and over in a lot of studies. What we're not quite sure about is why. And I think that in some places we could poke a little bit harder at what we mean by a network to try to get to some of that. So another finding that seems to be found in social science is that women often have more friends on average than men. And so maybe this is more weak ties, more strong ties, more opportunities to find out what's going on. Other factors are that women are still disproportionately like child rearing. And so if you're not spending time with children and you acquire a new form, but you don't hang out with the next generation, it just doesn't get passed on. So it's a bit of a dead end. So there's a variety of potential reasons. And I think that this is something that would really benefit from people doing a more fine-grained network analysis to figure out, like, maybe we could actually, maybe not all women have friends.
We're allowed to not have friends.
Yeah, victory for feminism. Maybe some men do have lots of friends. I think this is probably plausible. And so maybe if you did a more fine-grained network analysis, and I don't know anyone who's done this study, but I'd love to hear about it if anyone does know it. If you did a more fine-grained analysis of like, do extroverts are they more likely to be on the vanguard of linguistic change, or people who list more friends when you ask them about their friends or something, more likely to be at the vanguard of linguistic change? I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. And maybe gender has been this proxy variable for something else.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Because like I don't feel like I don't feel like I want a biological explanation for this. I feel like it's social, probably a variable of something else. But it'd be very interesting to try to disentangle that, in the same way that like age feels like it's a proxy variable for like, are you at a consistent life stage? The point at which age starts seeming a little bit less relevant to linguistic change is the point at which people stop doing exactly the same thing as all the other 17-year-olds. If high school was 5 years longer or 5 years shorter, then we would probably find those things correlate with, years in schooling, doing the same thing as other people your age, more than years in doing something else. So yeah, like there's a study on beer forums, but you could also do a study of like new parents end up learning a whole lot of words relating to, all these different types of like, are you going to do sleep training? Are you going to do like baby-led weaning? Or
I just had some flashbacks
so much of it.
to my own early days of parenting. And truly, when you join those forums, when you join those, especially online communities, your vocabulary shifts so fast and so hard.
Yeah, and there's these acronyms like DD and DS for like darling
DH.
daughter, darling son, DH, dear husband. And these have been around for like 20 plus years. These are not new acronyms. They've been documented like old enough that I think some of the original like darling children could now become parents themselves. Like they've really been around for a while, but they keep getting like reinvented every few years because people become new parents in a cyclic fashion fashion. And so it's got this kind of like replacement aspect to it in terms of a population level.
It does.
But then you don't stay in the forums once you like stop having young kids such that you're really desperately looking for advice on how to get the baby to sleep.
Exactly. It's so interesting because and just like any social group, I'm sure all of that stuff comes in so fast, and it almost feels like within the span of a few weeks, a few months, your way of speaking, your way of writing, especially on these online forums, shifts so quickly to the point that you don't really think about it all that hard, but it does. It makes a really big change. And on that idea of shifting into writing, I'm not sure how old you are, but I'm an elder millennial. So I can vividly remember being a young teenager right at the advent of the internet as we know it today. And I remember the adults at that time absolutely freaking out about how we used abbreviations and slang online, and everyone seemed really concerned that my microgeneration's language development was doomed because of this. And something that you did in your book, which I loved, was explain how the era in which people came online or sort of like joined these communities, if you will, makes a big difference to the type of language that they use when communicating online. So can you talk to us a little bit about that, about when we come online and the different eras of that?
There's this wonderful paper by Crispin Thurlow, who's not a linguist, I think he's a sociologist or something in that field, analyzing these sort of generational moral panics around how people talk about internet language and kids using them. And the paper is analyzing the sort of acronym era, which I also remember of like, oh no, the kids are going to only communicate in acronyms now. Yes. And there were all these hyperbolic media articles that were generally not citing examples of actual practice. They were creating these constructive examples of acronyms that nobody ever used. Like they would include a sort of like a BTW or an LOL or something, and then they would invent all these sort of fanciful acronyms that no one had ever used for sort of useless purposes and just be like, this is what the kids are doing. And I remember reading these and thinking, maybe I'm just not cool enough to know what these acronyms stand for. Actually, what they were was a moral panic and not this at all. And I saw this coming up again when it came to talking about emoji, which I think people have gotten a bit less moral panicky about now because, oh, look, we've had emoji for over 10 years and it's been fine. And the kids are still using words also. But there was this big sort of like, well, what if the kids are only going to communicate in little pictures and sort of all of the like adults? There was this program on like American TV local news at some point where they were bringing up all of these random emoji. This one stands for drugs. And none of them did was the thing. Like it was all like, you know, the hibiscus flower. And it's like, no one's ever used that. Like,
no one uses that.
No one uses that. And they included a couple of real examples of emoji that do have like a slang meaning, but they got the meanings wrong. Like it was just really some like middle-aged people in a boardroom making up what the teens do, or else some teens having a joke at the expense of adults, which I would not fault them for.
Not at all. I applaud them.
Yeah, I applaud them for, you know, messing with some overly credulous adults. Just thinking about, like, could we not be overly credulous about linguistic change? I talked about 5 different groups of internet people, sort of waves of internet people, and I don't think I can do them justice orally because it's hard to summarize a list of 5 things. Everyone likes a list of 3 things. So please read this in the actual book.
Yeah, please read the book.
But it's been something that people keep contacting me about and saying, like, I resonate with this because I'm like an old internet person, someone who was on the internet before it became mainstream or cool, or I am someone who joined the internet as part of that full mainstreamization wave, or I'm someone that's like on the cusp between these 2 groups, because of course some people fall between the cracks of any particular group, but it's useful to describe a few categories and let people sort themselves between them, or someone who joined the internet after it was already super mainstream. This is something that I think is kind of neat, where people who joined the internet as part of that big mainstreamization wave and sort of some of them joined with their friends and some of them joined sort of through their work, but they all were part of creating what the norms are for the internet, and they all get so shocked by like young people who don't know how to write an email anymore, or young people who don't know how to find a file in a folder system. A lot of people have told me that their students don't know how to find a file in a folder system because you don't need to do it on a smartphone. And you used to need to know how to do things like that just to use a computer, because computers used to be different. I mean, in the early days of cars, in order to drive a car, you had to be like a mechanic because the cars would just stall so much much, and you had to know about your own carburetor and all of this sort of stuff. And these days, some people know how cars work, but a lot of people can just drive a car, and if their car goes wrong, they take it into a shop or they call, roadside assistance or whatever. Someone else fixes it, because the world has this like fractal level of complexity, and we don't all have to know how every single complex system works. I don't know. I just turned a light bulb on today, and like, I don't know actually properly how a light bulb works.
Right.
And this is just how things happen. And when you abstract away certain levels of complexity, that makes it easier to do other things that used to be unimaginably complex because some of the other layers have gotten abstracted away. I don't think it's worth sort of doom and glooming about. There has been, I remember a lot of hyperbole about the idea that some group of people somewhere, and it's always like the teens, even though they've been saying this for 20 years, and those teens are no longer teens, but it's still the teens anymore. But now it's the current teens, and they didn't notice that this didn't really happen for the other teens, that some group of kids was going to be so good at the internet and so good at technology that they were going to be quote unquote digital natives. No one was going to have to teach them anything because they were just going to learn it themselves. Well, has this ever been true for any group of young people? That they've just taught it themselves everything and they've had no need for mentorship? Absolutely not. There are certain skills that young people learn for sort of social reasons to communicate with each other. And those skills might not need to be taught in schools the same way because they're teaching each other certain types of skills. But if you want people to learn the kind of drier skills that are workplace related, somebody, whether it's a parent or a teacher or like an internship counselor or something, somebody is going to have to explain how to do this at some point, because there's a lot of things that workplaces want that like you talking to your friends does not actually require.
Exactly. And I do think that, especially since I was a teenager and I can remember, all of the grownups then saying, now you don't even know how to look up like for a library book in the Dewey Decimal System. You don't know how to go into those, file cards or anything. And that became this point of the grownups saying, like, look at the kids these days. But grownups have always been saying, look at the kids these days. And especially in terms of language and the way that we talk. Although I now have a bone to pick with Gen X and the boomers, because one of my favorite chapters in your book is called The Typographical Tone of Voice. What is a typographical tone of voice? Why do Gen X and boomers use so many ellipses when they type a message? And why do these ellipses scare me so much as an elder millennial?
The idea of typographical tone of voice is that aspects of the way that you type certain words can reflect how you're intending that message to be read. So whether it's sort of slow or fast, loud or quiet, using a higher pitch or a lower pitch, or sort of an increasing, rising or falling pitch. And we have aspects of this in our conventional punctuation that's used in things like edited books or long edited prose rather than social media posts. Things like a question mark indicating a question mark intonation, or an exclamation mark indicating that something's a bit louder and more excited, perhaps. So or a period indicating the certain finality towards the end of a sentence. And so this is sort of there in typography to some extent. It's there in punctuation and in, capitalization to a certain extent. Something that was apparent to people in the very early days of the internet was that you could use things like all caps to indicate shouting. There was a period when all computers were entirely in all caps because memory was so expensive that there was no lowercase anywhere. Shortly after that period, there was a period when, suddenly now we have lower and uppercase, and people started using all caps to indicate shouting or emphasis or something being louder. And this one is pretty well known at this point. I think even most boomers and so on are fairly aware that all caps indicate shouting. Hopefully. But there was a period 20 years ago when people weren't aware. And there was all this sort of my boss types his emails in all caps. How do I explain to him that it's he's shouting? Some of these sort of take off and some of them don't take off. And there are this has a level of but this level of expressivity is important. I think that sometimes people compare modern day internet writing to sort of the older eras of edited prose in books, which is a false comparison. We still have books, and books now are actually quite a bit like books then, in terms of punctuation and capitalization and sort of editorial trends and like spelling, they haven't changed that much. Because the internet is written mostly in standard capitalization and punctuation, except in a few places where I'm like preserving something from a quote or doing something for emphasis. What's actually a better point of comparison is private and informal bits of writing that people did, like letters and postcards and diaries and even things like handwritten recipes or notes, to-do lists that you sort of scribble by the phone. And a lot of these have similar features that we now think of as internet features or text message features or social media features that used to be part of informal writing, but informal writing wasn't very visible. If you're making like a sign on a telephone pole, like lost cat or like yard sale or something like this, like that's informal writing. People will sometimes post on social media like photos from like, a local shop or something where they've put up a sign that says, we'll be back in 5 minutes, this sort of handwritten sign. And these also sometimes have features that are like social media, but a lot of these are handwritten. And so in handwriting, if you want to convey emotion, you have resources like writing some letters bigger, literally bigger. You don't have to worry about font size because you can just make them bigger on the page. You can underline them. You can underline them a lot. This sort of makes more sense because you're not just underlining something once to emphasize. You can underline it like 4 or 5 times. And you can do things in other colors in a pretty easy way because you just reach over for your other pen or for your like crayon. Some of the archival, like, scanned letters and so on that I was looking at for Because Internet that didn't make it into the book had like this gorgeous underline in like red crayon that's really emphatic. And people would draw little doodles in the margin sometimes because you have the whole page of paper, you have a pen, you can just put whatever you want on the page. In many ways, computers artificially constrained our abilities to do that kind of thing that we were already doing. If you are writing on your own website, or in your own Word document or whatever, yeah, you can change the fonts, you can change the colors, you can change the size of things. But for a lot of early computers, you couldn't necessarily do that in like, sort of text-based chat type places. And even these days, a lot of social media sites really constrain like what fonts you can use, what colors you can use, what size things can be, even whether you can put a link or not. These sites are sort of constraining what people can do so that they're like aesthetically uniform. But people keep wanting to express themselves. And so we have to find other ways of doing that. And some of that is playing with the typographical resources we have already. When I was writing Because Internet, this question of like, why do older people, and it's not all older people, I want to specify, but why do some older people use these ellipses so much? What are they doing with that?
What do they want us to think? What do they mean?
Yeah. What do they mean? Are they mad at me?
Are they mad?
Passive aggressive? Yeah. This was one of the questions that I got the most from especially sort of, elder millennials and younger that was asked of me when I was writing this. And so I was like, I have to find the answer. What I did was start looking back at handwritten stuff. What you find in older letters and especially I was looking at postcards because a postcard is sort of like an Instagram post, right? Like you have your picture on one side and then you have your caption on the other side. And a lot of older postcards that have been like scanned and digitized aren't even that long. And some of them, so there's this book called Postcards from the Boys, which digitizes a whole bunch of postcards by the members of the Beatles. 3 of the Beatles, John McCartney, Paul Lennon, Ringo Starr, they all write in relatively standard ways. But George Harrison writes with a lot of ... in his handwritten postcards. And when he'll write things like, much love ... George and Olivia. And when you type that out, it looks like a text message from your aunt.
It looks threatening, is what it looks like.
This is the thing with expectations.
Yes.
Because the ... one of its advantages is when we talk to each other, especially informally, we don't talk in complete sentences. We have sort of sentence fragments, we have bits trailing off, we have this and this and this and this, and it's very additive. And if you look at a transcript of a podcast, it'll be like, these people look so strange when they're talking if it hasn't been sort of edited into sentence form. But that's just what all talk looks like, and formal writing has this sort of sentence by sentence structure. But informal writing doesn't necessarily have to do that. And so when I asked older people, like I tried to ask them to reflect on their own usage, when I asked them why they would use the ... they would say things like, well, it's correct. The best I can get out of this is a ... doesn't commit to whether the next statement is an entirely independent sentence or whether it's, a clause that continues on from the next thing. So a period or a comma sort of commits to this is a full sentence or this is only part of a sentence. But a ... same with a dash. A lot of people also use a lot of dashes, can be used with either independent clauses or dependent clauses. And so it splits the difference. It means you don't have to think about this in informal writing. You can just do one of these things that doesn't commit to this type of thing, especially when what you're really worried about in your writing is what's correct. And so you're trying to do something that doesn't commit the error, quote unquote, of a comma splice. So you're like, well, I'll just use a ... because that'll be fine. Because these types of punctuation don't commit to whether or not it's a full clause or not. And in something like a postcard, you don't want to necessarily start a new line or something like that because you don't have that much space. Like space is at a premium. So you need a relatively compact way of doing that. For younger people or for people who have been online longer and are more used to the conventions of informal writing in a digital space rather than a physical piece of paper. So in the digital space, a new line is free. Like it doesn't take up more bytes than just a space. It's the same amount of space. So a lot of people will use a line break or they'll use a message break itself because you've got to, send the text message and then send the next one. And the message itself is the break in between thoughts. And if you want to put a break in between them, you can use a new line in some contexts, or you can just use here's the next message break. Those are relatively free these days. I mean, I remember the days when you were paying 15 cents for a text message and you're really trying to cram as much as possible into them.
Oh, I do too.
But these days, you can send as many texts as you want for free, and you can send them on, chat programs and things like that. Or somewhere like Twitter or Facebook or something, you can put a couple different line breaks in to separate a few ideas if you want to do them in the same post. So everybody is searching for this sort of neutral way of just separating thoughts a bit that doesn't commit to this is a full sentence, this isn't a full sentence, sort of whatever. And for younger people, that's the line break or the message break. That means that the period and the ... are sort of free to take on other interpretations. Because if you were just doing the neutral thing, the unremarkable thing, you'd just be using a line break or a message break, goes the logic of this group. And so if you're putting a ... or even in some context, like a single period where a period isn't necessary because you've just sent a new message, then that can indicate a certain amount of weight or a certain amount of pause or a certain amount of something left unsaid. A period, you sort of canonically, if you're reading a declarative sentence, can indicate a falling intonation. And that falling intonation could be something like the difference between thank you, which I'm reading with sort of exclamation mark, like polite, cheerful intonation, versus thank you, where you're like, oh no, is this sarcastic? Is there something gone wrong? And so this is what the periods and the exclamation marks are conveying if you have line breaks and message breaks as your default separator. If you don't have line breaks and message breaks as your default separator, you're getting these other ones as a default separator and you're not interpreting any additional tone. I don't want to say that one of these ways is right or wrong, or that one of these ways is good or bad. I think it's useful for people to be aware that there are two ways for this to be interpreted in sort of both directions. The thing that I encounter from people who use the ... there are lots of contexts in which people still use periods all over the place if you're sending a multi-sentence message. But if you're sending just thanks period as a single message, thanks.
Oh, that scares me so much.
But what I hear from this older group, sort of a surprise that anybody could be reading in that much information into what they're saying. A surprise that this is even possible. And so this is a group that's still saying something that I encountered a lot when I was writing Because Internet, that the internet and writing is fundamentally incapable of conveying tone of voice. And for this younger group, they're like, absolutely not. I am conveying a lot of tone of voice in writing. And occasionally you get confused, but you sometimes get confused face to face as well. And this older group is saying, no, it's fundamentally impossible. Therefore, no one should ever be inferring anything about tone of voice based on how someone's punctuating something, because this is just not what I'm trying to do. And you do have some, this is why I talk about sort of 5 generations of internet people, and I don't use the sort of demographic categories of millennials or boomers in the same way, because people who have been on the internet for a long time before it was mainstream also have this understanding of typographical tone of voice and of conveying tone in writing because they've been doing it for even longer. And many of them, well, if you were getting on the internet in like the early bulletin board systems of the 1980s, you're not 20 right now because time has elapsed. They were a whole bunch of ages at the time, but they've all aged up together and still have, like, these are the people who gave us the smiley face. Like, come on, they were really trying to make it capable,
right.
the internet capable of doing stuff like this.
That is such a good point that it circles back to this idea of how long have you been online? What has your experience of either handwriting or typing messages online been? Kind of how did you come up in that age? And like you said, I think that it's not that any one way is right or wrong. And I'm sure that Gen Z or Gen Z, looks at our text messages and says, oh my God, I can't believe that they type that way, and it's going to keep doing that, which is normal.
I've been informed that reaction GIFs are such a millennial thing.
I know, I have too, and it hurts.
Sorry. GIFs are really interesting because they were in like the 90s and they sort of fell out in the 2000s and they came back in like the 2010s. So maybe there's like a GIF drought in the 2020s and they'll be back in like the 30s as retro cool again. You never know, right?
That's going to be our era, is the 2030s, the resurgence of the GIF. Exactly. And you and your Lingthusiasm co-host, Lauren, have so many amazing Lingthusiasm episodes. And I want to encourage everyone to go check out Lingthusiasm. But especially in episode 34, you talk about because internet, also talk about emoji and gesture and things like that. And before we wrap up, can you tell us a bit more about Lingthusiasm and maybe some of your favorite topics that you've done and why people should go check it out and start listening?
Yeah, absolutely. So Lauren Gahn is my co-host on Lingthusiasm, and she's an Australian linguist who I got to know via the internet, as one does. She's a specialist in gestures, so she was the one who sort of talked me through the idea that emoji are like gesture in terms of how we use them with other linguistic resources rather than doing a lot of gestures all by themselves. And sort of, if you do that, it's more like a fun game like charades rather than this sort of fully fledged linguistic system, which is something we're looking for in addition to the tone of voice. So that episode, we're talking about emoji and gestures in episode 34. We also did an episode very recently about orality and literacy and understanding oral cultures. In this, I read an academic book by Walter J. Ong called Orality and Literacy, which is a really interesting book. And it was published in 1982. And there are a few parts that don't quite stand up, but a lot of it is really, really interesting as far as its observations go. And I wish that I'd read this book before writing Because Internet. So here's your sort of esprit d'escalier of like what I wish I also been able to say. He talks about how in oral cultures, one of your primary issues that you're trying to solve is like generational memory and transmitting useful and cultural and relevant information across generations, whether this is things like genealogies or cultural histories, but also just as simple as things that are like useful aphorisms to know. And so information becomes repeated in an oral culture because it's in some sort of memorable unit. So you have something like a stitch in time saves 9, which rhymes, or, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, which has this sort of beautiful couplet structure. Or, red sky at night, sailor's delight, kind of red sky in the morning, sailors take warning, which has, sometimes people say farmer's delight or something like that instead, or shepherd's delight, depending on how bucolic versus marine your region is. But it keeps the rhythm and the rhyme of the structure there so that you can pass along this type of folk wisdom, because everything has to pass mind to mind. And so if it's not memorable, it doesn't get passed on. What this means is that in an oral culture, you're really trying to remember and transmit these, in many cases, very sort of fixed phrases or these sort of fixed templates that have a limited degree of variation, but are still very, very memorable. Things like proverbs and, fairy tales that always have like 3 sisters or 3 brothers or 3 come in rules of three, and they have certain types of stock figures, a princess and a dragon and a witch, and these types of stock figures that can sort of combine and recombine and become very memorable units. What was interesting to me to contrast this with was the internet has this meme culture of things that keep getting remixed and recreated. The earliest stages of meme culture, the lolcats that people cite that are now like very much vintage memes, were passing around the same images. People would keep re-uploading the same images of cats, and there were a few that really reoccurred. These days, memes have become a lot more oral in some ways because it's a repetition of the same thing. Memes have become so much less oral and more written because when you see a new meme going around, you can go look it up on Know Your Meme. You can find out what the template is. You can see a bunch of examples. And then the goal is to create your own riff. People in some cases encounter like several derivatives. But like if I go on Twitter or somewhere like that and I see like one kind of weird tweet, I'm like, oh, that's weird. And then if I see two tweets that are weird in the same way, I'm like, oh, new meme just dropped.
Yep.
People can create riffs so much easier and can adapt new bits of cultural information to remix so much easier when we have reference materials, which are fundamentally a written culture thing. So this idea that you have a Know Your Meme entry or a Wikipedia page or like a Vox explainer about here's how this meme works, and here it is explained for people who don't get it, that is such a written culture thing to do. In oral culture, if you weren't there, you have to be told this story by someone and you get it altered in the retelling. You don't get to just scroll back a couple hours later and experience all the jokes just in the same order, and you're not doing as much in terms of like creating your own versions immediately. You're doing the retelling of the existing stuff, the retelling of the best of the existing stuff. Newer versions happen much more slowly because you can't just go consume and digest the entire previous body of work. It's sort of a slower way of information transmission because people have to be physically there to say it. Yeah, I wish I'd sort of had more of that literature foundation in what oral culture is and how the information transmission happens there, because I think that a lot of people sort of blithely say that the internet is an oral culture, which it's really not. It's so written. It's got so many written features. And what is actually the case is that it's domains of the human experience that used to be primarily oral are happening more in writing now, which is different from saying that the internet is oral. It is, in fact, informal language becoming much more written than it used to be.
That's so cool. But also I look forward to your next book where you do get to incorporate all of those things. So you'll have to do that next time.
It's not going to be because of Internet 2.0. So I used to joke, I was joking for a while that maybe my second book would have to be called Despite Internet, how I wrote a book despite being distracted online.
Yes, please. I would read that. Gretchen, thank you so much for your time today. And thank you for chatting with me. And there is so much of Because Internet that we didn't cover today, like the rise of emoji. We talked a little bit about meme culture, but also you have a whole section about the history of email etiquette. So if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to read the book and also be sure to subscribe to the Enthusiasm podcast. And also,
thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. And if you liked listening to our chat today, please subscribe to the Language on the Move podcast, leave a 5-star review on your podcast app of choice, and recommend the Language on the Move podcast and our partner, the New Books Network, to your students, colleagues, and friends. Till next time.